Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the final stretch of our 5-part series here on World War I from Epic History TV. If you haven't already yet, go check out years 1914 up until 1918 here. And so 1918 is obviously the year that the war ends on 11/11, 1918 at 11/11. So in the Commonwealth countries, this is Remembrance Day for us. So on November 11th, at 11/11, we take a minute of silence to remember the fallen. Obviously, in the United States, they have Memorial Day, as well as some other countries. They have different ways of celebrating it, but that's where in the Commonwealth countries, we have our Remembrance Day. So I won't talk too much about what's going to happen here in this video, because this is really the end of the war, and we're going to see all the dominoes fall. And so Germany will eventually capitulate. The military situation becomes unattainable for victory for the Central Powers, and slowly the dominoes will fall. So without further ado, let's get into it. And if you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. All helps the channel. Let's go.
After 3.5 years of war, the Allies are in crisis.
So one thing too is that even though it's only been 3.5 years of war, at this point, this is the most human lives ever lost in a conflict in human history. And as I've said before, World War II will dwarf these numbers, but this has been just a catastrophic war for human lives. And unlike in the Second World War, where the majority of casualties came from the Eastern Front, there are casualties taken on from all nations, and for some of them in the millions, but for most of them in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands.
Russia has been rocked by revolution, and its new Bolshevik government has signed an armistice with the Central Powers. Thousands of German troops will be freed up to fight on the Western Front, where the carnage of trench warfare has already claimed more than 1 million lives.
Yeah, think about that.
But Germany is also desperate. Britain's long naval blockade has led to shortages and social unrest at home, while America's entry into the war brings fresh manpower and vast resources to the Allied cause.
Yep.
Germany faces inevitable defeat unless it can win a quick victory on the Western Front.
Yes, Kaiserschlacht. If you're a Sabaton fan, you know what this is about.
US President Wilson announces his 14 points. They outline his vision for a post-war world, including an end to secret treaties, a reduction in the size of armed forces, self-determination for the people of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and an international organization to settle future disputes. But
let's take a look at these points, actually. So Woodrow Wilson,
people of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
So Woodrow Wilson, in sort of our modern times, is becoming less and less, what would you say, glorified as a president. A lot of his terrible racist domestic policies have been brought up, as well as him as a character. If you know who Vlogging Through History is, which, I mean, look at this setup. That was, one of the things that inspired this channel. He absolutely despises Woodrow Wilson, and I'd recommend you to go check out his channel on some of his Woodrow Wilson videos, because they're great. But when you look at these points, you can't look at these and say, yeah, these are terrible, right? No more secret treaties. Very, very important here that, you're not allowed to have, which this would be violated almost immediately. But, two nations are not allowed to really have these treaties that are going to affect millions of people without even the people really knowing about it, right? A free navigation of the seas. No more economic barriers between nations, which even to this day still has not been fully achieved, right? The reduction in armed forces, and all of these are very idealist and liberal, small L liberal, if you will, right? Very liberal points that a lot of these would really come to, in a way, be one of the foundations of our modern world, particularly when it comes to the economic points here, right? As well as the self-determination for the peoples of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which we still have these nations today. There's no large empires in Europe as there was back then, right? And so for the Balkan states to be freed from occupation, which again, this has to do more with the points of this time, but the Balkan states now being their own independent countries, an independent Poland, right? And so although Woodrow Wilson, say what you will about him, his points, I think for the time are really quite forward-thinking and quite progressive. And, it's a shame that they were almost completely ignored in the aftermath of the war.
Empire, and an international organization to settle future disputes.
Which, again, a good idea.
Most European leaders dismiss his ideas as wishful thinking.
Yeah.
At Brest-Litovsk, Bolshevik Russia signs a peace treaty with the Central Powers. Russia gives up vast amounts of territory in exchange for peace.
Yeah, and so to say it's vast amounts of territory is kind of an understatement. I've talked about this in a Russia Country series, but they lose 25% of their economy in this, and a substantial portion of their population, right? And as you can see within the territory here is obviously Ukraine, right? So they lose a lot of that agricultural production. They lose a lot of the industry, all the Baltic states. And so Russia loses a ton in World War I. And this was a very punitive treaty and really hurt the Russians for economy, certainly for the next years to come. Obviously, this is better for the people that were living under the Russian Empire, of course. But from an economical perspective for Russia, this really hurt them.
1 million German troops can now be redeployed from the east to the Western Front, where German General Erich Ludendorff plans an all-out, last-ditch offensive to win the war.
This guy was horrible.
Ludendorff's spring offensive catches the Allies off guard. German stormtroopers, using new infiltration tactics, help to overwhelm the British Fifth Army, which is soon in full retreat.
Sturmtruppen, I think.
The German advance threatens to split the British and French armies, with disastrous consequences. So French General Ferdinand Foch is appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces to coordinate strategy. Outside Amiens, British and Australian troops improvise a defense and finally halt the German advance.
That's a weird flag for the... Is that Australia's old flag? I don't know enough about Australia, unfortunately, but that's odd. Okay, anyways.
The German offensive switches to the north, targeting the Channel ports. But the British inflict heavy losses on the Germans and prevent a breakthrough. Above the trenches, the First Air War continues to escalate. Each side now has more than 3,000 aircraft in service on the Western Front. But by 1918, the Allies have won air superiority, thanks to greater resources.
Yeah, exactly. And this just came down to production. It came down to technology as well. So at this point, the Allies are really catching up in their plane technology. The Fokkers planes, which are famous for Germany, they're finally able to really rival them. So when you had Bloody April in April of 1917, where RAF forces were being shot down 4-1 compared to the Germans, things have finally picked up here again. And it's kind of similar how this, what would you say, the dwindling of air superiority for Germany, in a way sort of rivals what would happen again 20 years later in the Second World War. Well, almost 30, but you know what I mean.
On the 21st of April, Germany's most famous pilot, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, is shot down and killed near Amiens. With 80 victories, he's the war's highest-scoring ace, and is buried by the Allies with full military honours.
Which, respect to that, right? I mean, you can only imagine that these are countrymen that are holding wreaths for a man who shot down their fellow countrymen, right? But yeah, so the Red Baron, so Arthur, I want to say it's Arthur Brown. Arthur Brown, that's it. So he was a Canadian that was originally credited with killing the Red Baron. However, it's more likely actually that the modern understanding of it now is that he was probably killed by anti-aircraft machine guns. If I remember correctly, he was shot through the right arm here, and he was sort of pierced up this way, which would lead it to most likely be anti-aircraft guns on the ground and not Brown, who would have been chasing him, and the trajectory would have gone more through his back or along these lines, and wouldn't have been, in this case, shot from underneath, of course. What's super interesting, actually, is that the place where the Red Baron crashed, his plane was recovered, and it actually is in the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and I've seen it, and you can see the chair, and you can see the under part of the body there, and it's just riddled with bullet holes, and it was super cool just to see this little rickety piece of metal that he was sitting on. It's just got cloth, and it's not the fancy flight chairs that we have nowadays. It's literally just a piece of metal and just some cloth and just sitting underneath that. And it's obviously stained because it's over 100 years old, but that was kind of a cool thing to see.
Britain's new independent bombing force launches a daylight raid against Cologne. It marks the beginning of Britain's own strategic bombing campaign.
Yep. Which Germany had done to
On
London.
On the ground, Ludendorff's offensive switches south.
Sorry, not London, central England.
Targeting the French. German troops advance 30 miles, but are halted at the River Marne.
Again.
Just as fresh American divisions enter the line.
Just as they were earlier in the war.
The US 1st Division is the first to see combat at the Battle of Cantigny. 3 days later, the US 2nd Division wins victory at the Battle of Belleau Wood. By now, there are nearly 1 million American soldiers in France, with 10,000 more arriving every day.
Crazy.
The fourth phase of the German offensive leads to a 9-mile advance, but is finally halted by a French counterattack. In Italy, Austria-Hungary launches an attack at Asiago and the Piave River to support Ludendorff's offensive in France. But it's repulsed with heavy losses, and morale amongst the Austro-Hungarian army collapses.
And at this point, Austro-Hungary is basically being torn apart internally. So Franz Josef has died. He's one of the unifying figures. Karl, then, he's in charge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at this point, who's Franz Josef's nephew. And at this point, there's just so much tension between, obviously, the dual monarchy in Hungary and Austria itself, as well as the Serbs, Czechs, Poles, and the multiple ethnicities that are living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it's just tearing itself apart, right? The empire is not sustainable. Karl can mostly see the writing on the wall, though he desperately tries to cling on to the empire and really keep it together. And I'll get into Austria's history at some point later, but he would once again try to get himself crowned after World War I is all finished.
British and French troops land at Murmansk in northern Russia. It's the beginning of Allied intervention in Russia's civil war.
I was like,
on the side of so-called white or anti-Bolshevik forces. On the Western Front, the Germans' final attack is defeated in the Second Battle of the Marne. Ludendorff's offensive has cost the Germans more than 600,000 casualties and has failed to make a decisive breakthrough. Germany's final...
Sorry, I'm always smiling because that is like the most After Effects explosion I've ever seen in my life. I think that's a generic explosion.
Gamble has failed.
of instability. So Tsar Ferdinand, eventually he abdicates, which is the Tsar at the current moment for Bulgaria, who was ruled for, I think, a few decades at this point. And I think his son, maybe it's his nephew, but anyway, someone related. Tsar Boris III then eventually steps up and he becomes the leader of Bulgaria, and this would begin basically a military dictatorship until the end of the Second World War, when eventually the communists overthrow the government and then install a communist dictatorship that would be in place until the early 1990s, with the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union overall.
In the Middle East, British-led forces defeat the Turks at the Battle of Megiddo, taking 25,000 prisoners. Allied troops soon occupy Damascus and Aleppo.
Again, these are cities that have been in control of the Ottomans for hundreds of years, so this is huge.
On the Western Front, Marshal Foch orders a general attack. British, French, and American armies reach the Hindenburg Line, a line of reinforced German defences, and break through.
Yep.
Ludendorff informs the Kaiser that the military situation is hopeless and that Germany must seek an armistice.
And Ludendorff is such a rat too. He's such a... I read a biography about from Ian Kershaw on Adolf Hitler, and it talks a bit about Ludendorff and his involvement during the Bierputsch, as well as his involvement in sort of the Freikorps and the right-wing paramilitary that would prop up after the war. And despite the fact that there's now evidence of him, writing that basically the war is lost and militarily it's hopeless, he would never really come publicly out and say that it was hopeless, it was lost, there was nothing we could do, it was over. And he would really fuel a lot of this right-wing paramilitary stab in the back theories that would come in post-war Germany. And it's just such a despicable character in my eyes. Ugh.
Germany sends a request to US President Woodrow Wilson, who in return demands German withdrawal from all occupied territory and the Kaiser's abdication.
Reasonable enough.
On the Italian front, the Allies deliver the final blow to Austria-Hungary at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The Austro-Hungarian army disintegrates, and 300,000 prisoners are taken. With the Central Powers facing collapse, the Ottoman Empire signs an armistice with the Allies at Mudros. 4 days later, Austria-Hungary signs an armistice with the Allies at Villa Giusti. At Kiel, the German High Seas Fleet is ordered to make a suicidal attack on the British Navy.
And then they mutiny.
But instead, it mutinies. Revolution spreads through Germany. The Kaiser abdicates, and a German Republic is proclaimed.
And so the German Republic was proclaimed, and it didn't satisfy anyone. So there was a brief bit of actual socialist, so communism in Bavaria, where the I don't want to. This is where it gets a little tricky, but you know what? For lack of a better term, let's call them communists, where the communists really take over, and they install a communist dictatorship for a few months in the province of Bavaria. Now, the conservatives are still trying to basically have a military dictatorship. They're trying to hold on to the authoritarianism that they have at this point. And the left-wing parties generally are trying to sort of fit into a republic, a socialist democracy. Some of them are trying to instill communism at this point. And Germany is just an absolute mess. It's a complete mess. And for me to go into way more detail would take a lot longer. So this is just a very, very oversimplified version. I know it's more complicated than this. But the German Republic is trying to satisfy both the left and the right, and neither side truly gets what they want. So the right they have to accept obviously the humiliating treaty. and there's a lot of parliamentary. So there's basically you have weaker governments because they have to make these large coalitions, and the left doesn't quite get what they want because there's still a lot of those old systems that are in place in Germany, and they follow through over into the Republic as well. And so it's a really, really interesting topic of sort of how this transition happened. It was very messy, and the Weimar Republic obviously would not last because it's going to be overthrown by 1933 by the Nazis and Adolf Hitler.
On the 11th of November 1918, a German delegation signs an armistice with the Allies inside Marshal Foch's railway carriage at Compiègne.
So this railway carriage, when the Nazis defeated France, when the Nazis defeated France 22 years later, this exact rail car was rolled out of the museum, and France had to sign its surrender terms to the Germans in front of the German delegation there. And so, yeah, if that isn't petty revenge, I don't know what is.
It comes into force at 11 a.m. But fighting continues until the last moment.
Second. Yep, shame.
American Private Henry Gunter is killed, charging a German machine gun at 10:59.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, this was a very foolhardy thing to do. He was actually ordered against doing this, and the Germans were yelling at him to not. But he rushed through no man's land, and he was... And I don't remember the exact story, but I think that there was something to do with his relationship at this point. He was very upset, and he was trying to sort of get back that honor, if you will. So he wasn't the last one that was killed in really, sort of an active combat sense, if you will. But this was sort of due to his own foolishness that he got himself killed.
He is thought to be the last soldier killed during World War I. 3 days later, in East Africa, German General von Lettow-Vorbeck surrenders his army on the Chambezi River. For 4 years, he has tied down huge numbers of Allied troops, remaining undefeated while cut off from home. He is still considered one of history's greatest guerrilla leaders.
Yeah. And I mean, look at this quote, right? So I think it was Bismarck that said in 1894 that within 20 years there would be war in Europe, and it would probably have something to do with the Balkans. And obviously that's paraphrasing. And he was completely right. And then Marshal Foch says in 1919, this is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. And then not on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland and begins World War II. So how right he was. It's eerie.
The Paris Peace Conference opens at the Palace of Versailles, just outside the French capital. Delegates accept a proposal to create a League of Nations to settle future international disputes. The Versailles Treaty, signed in June, imposes harsh terms on Germany. Its military is restricted in size. It must pay war reparations to the Allies. It loses territory to its neighbours. And its colonies are seized by the victors.
Yep. As well as in China,
Germany must also accept responsibility for the war in a war guilt clause, a source of lasting resentment in Germany.
And so this is the ultimate irony, right? Is that I live in Austria, right? As you guys know. And Austria basically starts World War I. And while Germany, yes, fell into it and yes, issued the blank check, and obviously they are to blame. But they have to accept this war guilt clause. And then an Austrian causes World War II. And then Austria somehow comes out of that as the first victim of Nazi aggression, which thankfully the government at this point, the Austrian government, has basically admitted that that was a complete sham. And while the politics at the time meant they had to, and with the... Anyways, that's a whole other story. But it's good that now the Austrian government realizes that, yes, that was a complete sham. They were not the first victims of Nazi aggression. Yeah, it's just funny how Austria gets away with starting kind of 2 world wars. Blames it all on Germany.
The boundaries of Europe are redrawn. Poland re-emerges after 100 years of foreign rule, while Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and an enlarged Romania emerge from the ashes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Romania looks a little weird.
The Ottoman Empire is dismantled. New states, most under European control, are created in the Middle East. Here, as in Europe, the seeds of future conflict are sown.
Understatement of the century.
While in the Far East, former German possessions in China are handed to Japan, to China's outrage. World War I claimed the lives of 9.5 million soldiers. 1 in 8 of those who fought. 21 million more were wounded. 7 million civilians also lost their lives.
And this doesn't even show the losses that countries like Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, India, Japan, as well as some of the other countries that would eventually come into the conflict also lost. So the number is even hot. Well, not the 9.1 million, excuse me, but there's this visual representation. This doesn't account for all 9.8 million, or sorry, 9.1.
Huge areas of Europe were left devastated. Old empires vanished. New states were born. Lives across the world were transformed.
Yeah, and so just to talk about new states briefly. So they showed that quickly, but I want to show something that my sister made for me for Christmas. She embroidered this. So this is a map of Europe in 1936, and a lot of this is the post-war breakup of Europe overall. And so you can see these complete new states in the Balkans here, right, with Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia. And so really I'm of the opinion that Austria-Hungary here lost the most territory out of all the nations here. Yes, Germany did get some vital pieces of it ripped away, but Austria-Hungary was completely mutilated, if you will, right? It was the complete destruction of its empire and not just the country itself. And yeah, to talk about just how much World War I changed everything. As I said before, we sort of have World War II in our collective minds as being the war that changed everything, the war that created the modern world. But I'm of the opinion that this was really World War I. And though World War I would just sow the seeds of the violence, the anti-Semitism, the nationalism, which would come to basically engulf Europe in flames, in conflict that the world had never seen, and I hope never will see again. World War I is obviously hugely important to this, to the making of this as well. And so I think this is going to end in like 10 seconds here, but fantastic series from Epic History TV. I really enjoyed this, but I think I want to talk a little bit more about the consequences of World War I politically after I wrap up this France Country series here, which has taken me way too long to finish. But yeah, I want to talk about that at some point, where the sort of post-war years between 1918 and really, let's say, around 1929, up until the 30s and the rise of the Nazi power, and sort of how a lot of the ideas of the post-World War I treaties really sort of broke down, right? And how we ended up back in a place to where Europe was once again in a massive conflict. That, to me, is a really interesting question.
The world was never the same again.
It definitely wasn't. Yeah, so fantastic.
If you enjoyed this,
absolutely fantastic series from Epic History TV. Really, really enjoyed it, and they're always great videos. And yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this one. Thank you if you joined me for all 5 parts. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much. I hope it was informative. Hope you had fun. I certainly learned quite a lot from these videos. I always do. And yeah, next one up is going to be just the tail end of the France country series here. I'll be doing a geography now on France. That one will be a little bit more lighthearted. But yeah, First World War, one of the most important events in the 20th century by far. And what do you think? Do you think that it was just sort of a side note and really its biggest consequence was leading to World War II? Or do you think it had more implications than that? Let me know what you think in the comments section below. Thank you for joining me on this journey so far. Appreciate it. All the best. Take care. Merry Christmas if you're living in Europe and you celebrate it on the 24th or wherever you are in the world. And I'll be making a Christmas video tomorrow. Take care. All the best. See you in the next one.